The year is 1763, and the world has just changed forever. In the forests of Pennsylvania, the last echoes of musket fire fade as the French and Indian War comes to an end for 7 bloody years. American settlers have fought alongside red-coated soldiers against French forces and their Native American allies. Now a smoke clears from 100 battlefields, stretching from the Ohio Valley to the frozen shores of Quebec. The crown stands triumphant. The fleur-de-lis no longer flies over North America. The Union Jack waves supreme from Hudson Bay to the Florida Keys. But victory comes with a price that will shake an empire to its foundations in London's corridors of power. Chancellor of the Exchequer George Grenville stares at ledger books filled with devastating numbers. The war has cost the empire nearly £70 million, a sum so vast it strains comprehension. The national debt has doubled. Interest payments alone consume half the government's annual revenue. Across the Atlantic, 10,000 imperial soldiers remain stationed in North America, costing another £300,000 each year. Someone must pay for this empire. And Grenville is calculating. Eyes turned westward across 3,000 miles of ocean to the provinces that London has just fought so hard to protect. The provincials, meanwhile, celebrate their survival and dream of expansion in Virginia's smoky taverns. Planters speak excitedly of rich Ohio Valley lands, now opened for settlement. Pennsylvania farmers envision their sons carving homesteads from western forests. Massachusetts merchants calculate profits from new trading opportunities. These Americans have shed their blood alongside imperial regulars. They have mortgaged their futures to support the war effort. Surely they reason the fruits of victory belong to them as much as to any lord in London. Then comes the proclamation of 1763, sliding like a knife between American dreams and reality. King George, the third decree, forbids settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The very lands that inhabitants fought to win are now declared off limits, reserved for Native American tribes that mostly fought against the crown. Veterans who expected land grants find their service unrewarded. Speculators who purchased Western claims discover their investments worthless. The proclamation line stretches like an invisible wall from Canada to Georgia, containing provincial ambitions within boundaries that suddenly feel like prison walls. In Williamsburg, a young Virginia lawyer named Patrick Henry reads the proclamation with growing anger. The words seem to mock everything Americans have sacrificed for. How can the empire claim to protect them? By denying them the very expansion that protection was meant to secure in Boston. Samuel Adams, cousin to the future president, but already a master of political organization, sees opportunity and provincial frustration. A grievance, properly nurtured, can grow into defiance. But the proclamation of 1763 proves to be merely the first drop in a gathering storm. George Grenville financial calculations demand immediate action. If settlers benefit from imperial protection, London logic suggests they should help pay for it. The sugar measure of 1764 seems reasonable enough to metropolitan bureaucrats. A modest duty on molasses, sugar, and other luxury imports. But in the counting houses of Boston and New York, merchants discover that modest levies, properly enforced, can destroy profit margins built on generations of calculated risk. For decades, provincial merchants have operated in the comfortable shadows of Crown law. Customs officials, poorly paid and stationed far from London, oversight have developed flexible interpretations of trade regulations. A few coins in the right hands could transform prohibited cargo into legal imports. Smuggling was not crime, but commerce, not rebellion, but business as usual. The sugar statute changes everything. Royal naval patrols multiply. Customs enforcement becomes systematic and unforgiving. Merchants who built their fortunes on creative interpretations of trade law suddenly find themselves branded as criminals. But it is the stamp legislation of 1765 that transforms merchant complaints into popular revolution. Unlike the sugar statute, which affects primarily the commercial classes, the stamp decree touches every American life. Every newspaper must bear an official stamp. Every legal document requires government approval, purchased with imperial currency, playing cards, dice, pamphlets, college diplomas, marriage licenses. Nothing escapes the stamp master's attention. For the first time, London levies reached directly into provincial pockets, demanding tribute for the simple act of living as crown subjects. The constitutional implications horrify American lawyers trained in English legal tradition. Since the Magna Carta of 1215, English rights have rested on a fundamental principle: no assessment without voice in Commons. Yet provincials elect no members to the House. They send no delegates to the Lords. How, then, can Westminster claim authority to levy on them? The question burns through assemblies like wildfire through dry timber. In London, Westminster offers a sophisticated response: the theory of virtual voice. Every member of Commons, imperial politicians argue, speaks for not merely his local constituency, but the entire empire. Provincial interests are virtually voiced through members who consider the empire's broader good. Benjamin Franklin, serving as American agent in London, listens to these arguments with barely concealed contempt. Virtual voice, he observes, is about as useful as virtual food to a starving man. The stamp decree also introduces settlers to another crown innovation that will poison relationships for the next decade. The quartering measures imperial soldiers stationed in North America require housing, food, and supplies rather than burden the royal treasury. Commons simply mandates that provincial governments provide these necessities. Local authorities must furnish barracks, bedding, beer, rum, and everything else that soldiers need when public buildings prove insufficient. Private citizens must open their homes to uninvited guests and redcoats. Nothing violates English rights more fundamentally than forcing free men to house soldiers in peacetime. The Third Amendment to the future U.S. Constitution will specifically prohibit this practice, but in 1765 inhabits its lack constitutional protection against Westminster demands. Tavern keepers find their establishments commandeered. Homeowners discover that their property autonomy means nothing when weighed against military convenience. The quartering requirements transform every red-coated soldier into a symbol of provincial subjugation. Pushback begins in the shadows, but quickly moves into the light. In Boston, Samuel Adams organizes the Sons of Liberty, a name borrowed from a speech by Irish Member of Commons Isaac Barry, who praised the Sons of Liberty in America. Adams understands that successful dissent requires both secrecy and publicity. Both underground organization and public spectacle, the Sons of Liberty meet in private, but act in public, coordinating protests that appear spontaneous while following carefully orchestrated plans. The network spreads rapidly through provincial ports. In New York, Sons of Liberty organized under Isaac Sears and Alexander McDougall. Philadelphia's radicals rally around Charles Thompson. Charleston's dissident center on Christopher Gadsden, whose yellow flag bearing a coiled rattlesnake, and the words "Don't tread on me" will become an enduring symbol of American defiance. Each city develops its own methods, but all share common goals: oppose imperial assessment and coordinate provincial protest. The Sons of Liberty perfected the art of political theater. But when stamp distributors accept their appointments, they find themselves confronting angry crowds that somehow materialize at exactly the right moments. Effigies hang from liberty trees in city centers, symbolic executions that promise real consequences for anyone who enforces Crown law. Tar and feathers await customs officials who proved too diligent in their duties. The message spreads quickly. A collaboration with metropolitan authorities carries social and physical risks that far outweigh any financial rewards, but dissent requires more than street protests and intimidation. It demands legal justification and intellectual coherence. Provincial assemblies become laboratories for constitutional theory. In Virginia's House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry introduces resolutions that question Westminster's authority over American assessment. His words electrify listeners. If this be treason, make the most of it. Massachusetts General Court adopts similar resolutions, then calls for a stamp Congress to coordinate provincial responses. 9 provinces send delegates to New York in October 1765, creating the first inter-American political body since the Albany Congress of 1754. The Stamp Congress produces documents that will echo through the next decade of constitutional crisis. The delegates carefully distinguish between Westminster's right to regulate imperial trade and its claimed authority to levy on provincial property. External duties on imports, they concede, might fall within legislative power. But internal assessments on American property violate fundamental principles of English autonomy. The distinction seems clear to provincial minds, but London politicians find it suspiciously convenient. Meanwhile, another network begins forming that will prove even more important than the Sons of Liberty. The Committees of Correspondence Samuel Adams conceives the idea in Boston, but it spreads throughout the colonies like arteries, carrying revolutionary blood. Each town and county establishes a committee to maintain communication with neighboring communities and other colonies. When British authorities take action in one location, word spreads rapidly through the correspondence network, allowing coordinated responses before government officials can exploit colonial isolation. The committees transform 13 separate colonial societies into something resembling a unified political community. A farmer in Georgia learns within weeks about tax protests in Massachusetts. a merchant in Philadelphia, receives detailed accounts of customs enforcement in Charleston. For the first time, colonists begin to see their local grievances as part of a continental pattern of British oppression. In Virginia, the correspondence committees operate through the established social networks of the plantation elite. George Washington, though not yet committed to resistance, allows his Mount Vernon estate to serve as a meeting place for Fairfax County's committee. Thomas Jefferson, still a young lawyer building his practice, finds that correspondence committee work provides excellent preparation for the constitutional arguments that will soon consume his life. The Massachusetts committees develop a more democratic character, reflecting New England's tradition of town meetings and popular participation in local government. Samuel Adams uses the Boston Committee to coordinate resistance activities throughout the province, while his second cousin, John Adams, contributes legal expertise to justify colonial opposition in terms that English lawyers cannot easily dismiss. Pennsylvania's committees reflect the colony's religious and ethnic diversity. Quakers, who oppose violence on principle, struggle to balance their pacifist beliefs with growing anger at British policies. German immigrants, many of whom came to America to escape European taxation and military service, discover uncomfortable parallels between British demands and the oppression they sought to leave behind. Scots, Irish settlers, already suspicious of British authority, need little encouragement to resist London's latest demands. The debate over resistance versus loyalty divides colonial society along lines that will persist throughout the revolutionary crisis in every community. Neighbors find themselves on opposite sides of arguments about parliamentary authority, colonial rights, and the proper relationship between subjects and sovereign. Colonial merchants face particularly difficult choices. Their businesses depend on British trade connections and imperial commercial networks. Many have family relationships in London or personal friendships with British politicians. Yet they also suffer, most directly, from new tax policies and customs enforcement. The Sugar Act and Stamp Act threaten their profits, while the Quartering Acts disrupt their operations. Merchants like John Hancock in Boston and Henry Laurens in Charleston find themselves reluctantly drawn into resistance movements. Despite their preference for compromise and accommodation, religious communities struggle with conflicting loyalties. Anglican clergy, dependent on British support and committed to royal supremacy in religious matters, generally counsel obedience to constituted authority. But Congregationalist ministers in New England, Presbyterian pastors in the Middle Colonies, and Baptist preachers throughout the South often view British policies as threats to religious liberty, as well as civil rights. The Great Awakening of the 1740s has already weakened deference to established authority and strengthened beliefs in individual conscience and popular participation in religious life. These same principles easily transfer to political resistance. The question of loyalty versus liberty becomes intensely personal for thousands of colonial families. Sons argue with fathers about their obligations to the king. Wives disagree with husbands about the wisdom of resistance. Brothers find themselves on opposite sides of constitutional questions that seem abstract until they produce real consequences in daily life. As 1765 draws to a close, colonial resistance achieves its first major victory. The Stamp Act proves unenforceable throughout British North America. No colonial stamps are sold, because no one dares to sell them. Courts close rather than operate without stamped documents. Newspapers appear with skull and crossbones, where tax stamps should be placed. Business continues as usual, but without any acknowledgement of parliamentary authority. In London, British merchants who depend on colonial trade or begin pressuring Parliament for repeal. Colonial boycotts of British goods cost London businesses thousands of pounds in lost sales. Ships return to English ports with holds full of unsold merchandise. Credit networks that finance transatlantic commerce threaten to collapse under the strain of colonial resistance. The Rockingham Ministry, already struggling with domestic political problems, cannot ignore commercial pressure from their most important supporters. In March 1766, Parliament repeals the Stamp Act to tremendous colonial celebration. Bells ring in Boston. Cannons fire salutes in New York. Toasts are drunk in Philadelphia. Taverns. To the health of good. King George and the wisdom of Parliament. But the celebration proves premature. On the same day that Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, it passes the Declaratory Act, asserting Parliament's authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The constitutional question that divides Britain and America remains unresolved. Parliament claims unlimited authority over colonial affairs. Colonists insist on the same rights as any English subjects. These positions cannot be reconciled through compromise or accommodation. The Declaratory Act receives little attention in the euphoria of Stamp Act repeal. But Samuel Adams, another colonial leader, read its implications clearly. Britain has retreated tactically, but not strategically. The repeal represents a victory for colonial resistance. But the Declaratory Act promises future conflicts over the same fundamental issues. Parliament retains its theoretical claims to unlimited authority, while colonists have demonstrated practical ability to resist unwelcome policies. The stage is set for even more serious confrontations as ships carry news of the Stamp Act repealed across the Atlantic in the spring of 1766. Few colonists imagine that they have just experienced the first chapter of a revolutionary crisis that will consume the next decade of their lives. The seeds of rebellion planted in the frustrations of the Proclamation of 1763 are nurtured by the constitutional crises of the Sugar and Stamp Acts have taken root in American soil. The committees of correspondence provide communication networks for coordinated resistance. The Sons of Liberty offer organizational structures for popular protest. Colonial assemblies have developed constitutional arguments to justify opposition to parliamentary authority. Most importantly, 13 separate colonial societies have begun to discover their common interests and shared identity as Americans. They remain British subjects in law and mostly in sentiment, but they are no longer merely British subjects. Something new is emerging in the forests and cities of North America, a political community that can imagine resistance, organize opposition, and sustain defiance of the world's most powerful empire. The next test of this emerging American identity waits just beyond the horizon, approaching with the inevitability of a summer storm. British politicians, convinced that colonial resistance reflects temporary passion rather than permanent principle, are already planning new policies to assert parliamentary authority and raise colonial revenue. Colonial leaders, emboldened by their success against the Stamp Act, are preparing for even more serious challenges to their claims of English liberty. Neither side fully understands the forces they have set in motion, but both sense that something fundamental has changed in the relationship between Britain and her American colonies. The seeds of rebellion have been planted. Now they must grow or die, and the harvest will determine whether 13 separate colonies can become something unprecedented in human history. A free and independent nation, born from the assertion that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The quiet tension of these early years masks the approaching storm, but those with eyes to see can already detect the signs of revolutionary weather gathering on the horizon. The fuse has been lit. The question now is not whether it will burn, but when it will reach the powder keg of colonial resistance and British determination. That moment is coming sooner than anyone imagines, and when it arrives, it will illuminate a world transformed by the radical idea that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. The fuse is lit. How long it smolders before reaching the powder keg depends on choices yet to be made. Euphoria of victory fades quickly in the harsh light of London politics. Part 2. The road to revolution. Tea, blood, and resolve. While patriots celebrate the repeal of the Stamp Statute, Chancellor Charles Townshend already plots the next move in Westminster's constitutional chess game. His declaratory measure of 1766 has established the principle. Now he seeks to test mainland commitment to their constitutional theories. If settlers distinguish between internal assessments and external tariffs, he reasons, then let them face charges that touch their daily lives in ways they cannot ignore. Townshend's legislation of 1767 targets the building blocks of civilization itself. Glass for windows, paint for protection against weather, paper for communication, lead for construction, and the leaf for comfort, all now bare. Metropolitan exercises that transform necessities into symbols of London control. Unlike the Stamp Decree, which locals could simply refuse to purchase, these new fiscal burdens attach themselves to items that no household can do without. A settler family may choose to avoid legal documents requiring stamps, but they cannot survive without windows, walls, and writing material. These charges seem modest enough, mere pennies on each pound of goods, but their cumulative effect reaches into every mainland a home. A merchant glazing his shop windows pays the ministry for the privilege. A housewife purchasing the infusion for her family's comfort finances red-coated administration. A lawyer buying paper for his briefs contributes to the salaries of customs officials, who will scrutinize his every transaction. These measures transform ordinary commerce into unwilling collaboration with policies that locals find constitutionally odious. More insidiously, the Chancellor designates revenue from these tariffs to pay the salaries of governors and judges throughout the mainland. For generations, assemblies have controlled executive and judicial compensation through their power over appropriations. A governor who defies his legislature risks financial ruin. A judge who interprets law in ways that offend settler sentiment may find his salary suspended. Control over purse strings has been the province's most effective check on arbitrary authority. His scheme destroys this balance at a stroke. Metropolitan officials paid from London revenue need no longer court local favor or respect regional opinion. They become accountable only to Westminster, transforming the delicate constitutional equilibrium that has allowed mainland self-governance to flourish within the empire. Governors can now ignore assembly wishes. Judges can enforce unpopular statutes without fear of financial retaliation. Settlers discover that their practical autonomy depends on constitutional arrangements that London lawmakers can alter with a simple vote. Response comes swiftly, but selectively. The port city's merchants organize the first systematic economic warfare against affected goods, appealing to patriot pride as well as constitutional principle. Why purchase metropolitan manufactures when local artisans can supply regional needs? Non-importation transforms economic necessity into patriotic virtue, giving households throughout the continent a way to participate in constitutional struggle without attending rallies or joining organizations. Economic warfare spreads through networks already established during the stamp crisis. Committees of correspondence carry news of Massachusetts' capital actions to ports throughout the continent. New York merchants, initially reluctant to sacrifice profitable trade relationships, gradually join the movement as customer pressure mounts. Philadelphia's Quaker traders, torn between pacifist principles and commercial interests, developed creative compromises that allow parties to patient without violence. Charleston's rice planters, less dependent on imported goods. The northern neighbors nevertheless embrace economic warfare as a gesture of intercolonial solidarity. Women emerge as crucial participants in this commercial struggle. Household purchasing decisions. Traditionally, female responsibilities become political statements with continental implications. Daughters of Liberty organize spinning circles that transform cloth production into patriotic spectacle. Ladies who once prided themselves on fashionable London imports now compete to wear the plainest homespun garments. Previously, centers of feminine social life, drawing rooms stand transformed as hostesses serve local herbs rather than the imported leaf. Domestic transformations ripple through settler society in unexpected ways. Local manufacturers, previously scorned as inferior to metropolitan products, gain new respect and market share. Regional artisans find themselves overwhelmed with orders from customers who previously preferred imported goods. Economic refusal inadvertently nurtures domestic industry that will prove crucial during the coming years of commercial disruption. But financial pressure moves too slowly for some mainland tempers in the town. On the Charles, where Westminster officials concentrate and enforcement proves most vigorous daily friction between locals and customs collectors escalates into something approaching warfare. Revenue officers, armed with broad search powers and backed by London authority, ransacked warehouses and private homes, seeking evidence of smuggling. Merchants who built their fortunes on creative interpretations of trade regulations now face systematic persecution that threatens their livelihoods and social standing. John Hancock's sloop Liberty seizure in June 1768 crystallizes these tensions into open confrontation. Customs officials impound the vessel on suspicion of wine smuggling, triggering riots that force ministry officers to flee to Castle William in the harbor. Popular fury reflects not merely sympathy for Hancock, one of the city's wealthiest merchants, but rage at enforcement methods that violate traditional English protections against arbitrary searches and seizures. Governor Francis Bernard responds by requesting military reinforcement from General Thomas Gage in New York. Red-coated regiments arriving in the port city during October 1768 transformed constitutional dispute into military occupation for the first time since 1689. Westminster troops patrol the streets of a major mainland city not to repel foreign invasion, but to suppress domestic dissent. Soldiers drilling on the common, while citizens go about their daily business, creates an atmosphere of perpetual crisis that poisons relationships between locals and London authorities. Military presence proves counter-productive. From the moment the first regiment disembarks, soldiers competing for scarce jobs undercut local wages and anger. Working men already struggling with economic disruption. Off-duty troops drinking in taverns clash with customers who view them as symbols of oppression. Religious tensions surface as Catholic Irish soldiers attend Mass in a city where Protestant traditions run deep. Every interaction between military and civilian populations carries potential for escalation that could transform constitutional crisis into violent rebellion. Samuel Adams understands that martyrdom serves political purposes better than mere argument. Through his committees of correspondence and newspaper essays signed with classical pseudonyms, he systematically documents every instance of military misconduct. Every example of arbitrary enforcement, every violation of traditional English protections. His goal is not simply to chronicle grievances, but to create a narrative of systematic oppression that will justify extraordinary measures of self-defense. The explosion comes on a cold March evening in 1770, triggered by the kind of minor incident that often sparks major conflagrations. A British sentry standing guard outside the custom house strikes a young apprentice who insults him. Crowds gather as word spreads through the city's narrow streets. More soldiers arrive to rescue their comrade. Tension builds as civilians throw snowballs, ice, and insults at the military detachment. Someone shouts fire with a soldier or civilian, no one knows, and muskets discharge into the crowd. 5 Americans fall in King Street that night. Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American ancestry who worked the docks. Samuel Gray, a rope maker, caught up in the crowd. James Caldwell, a sailor visiting the city. Samuel Maverick, a 17-year-old apprentice, and Patrick Carr, an Irish immigrant who dies 9 days later from his wounds. The deaths transform a street confrontation into what Samuel Adams immediately labels the Boston Massacre, a term that will echo through American memory long after the constitutional issues that caused it are forgotten. The aftermath proves as significant as the event itself. Captain Thomas Preston and his 8 soldiers face trial for murder in a Boston court defended by John Adams. Despite his cousin Samuel's role in organizing the prosecution, the younger Adams believes that fair trials demonstrate American commitment to legal process, even in moments of passion. His successful defense of most defendants, 2 soldiers receive reduced sentences for manslaughter, establishes a crucial precedent. Americans can separate their hatred of imperial policies from their respect for English legal traditions, but Samuel Adams ensures that the political lessons of King Street spread far beyond Boston's courts. His account of the massacre, illustrated with Paul Revere's inflammatory engraving, circulates throughout the continent. Within weeks, the image shows disciplined soldiers firing into helpless civilians at an officer's command, a version of events that trial testimony will largely contradict, but which serves Adams's propaganda purposes perfectly. 5 deaths become symbols of imperial tyranny that will inspire resistance for the next decade. The Townshend crisis gradually subsides as both sides step back from the brink of wider conflict. London lawmakers, shaken by American economic pressure and domestic political changes, repeal most of the offensive duties. In April 1770, only the levy on tea remains preserved as a symbol of Westminster's constitutional authority, while eliminating the commercial disruption that threatened imperial trade relationships. Many Americans view this partial repeal as victory enough, similar to their triumph over the stamp statute 4 years earlier. But Samuel Adams and other radical organizers understand that the fundamental constitutional issues remain unresolved. The tea duty, however small, still represents the principle of assessment without voice that Americans find constitutionally intolerable. More importantly, the Townshend crisis has demonstrated that partial victories can dissolve popular enthusiasm for resistance, just when sustained pressure might achieve complete success. The next confrontation must be different, more focused, more dramatic, and more difficult. For moderate Americans to ignore or compromise away, the opportunity emerges from an unexpected source. Imperial bureaucrats trying to solve administrative problems rather than constitutional crises. The East India Company, crown jewel of London's commercial empire, teeters on the edge of bankruptcy. By 1773, years of mismanagement in India, costly territorial acquisitions and competition from private merchants have left the company with massive debts and £17 million of unsold tea, rotting in London warehouses. Company directors appeal to Westminster for relief, seeking not constitutional authority, but simple commercial survival. Lord North's ministry crafts an elegant solution that inadvertently creates the most serious imperial crisis since the stamp controversy. The tea legislation of 1773 grants the East India Company direct sales privileges in American ports, eliminating the middlemen who have traditionally distributed imported tea through local networks. The company can now sell directly to consumers at prices lower than any competitor, including smuggled Dutch tea that has captured much of the American market during years of boycotts and non-importation. The measure seems designed to benefit everyone. The company gains American sales needed for financial recovery. American consumers get cheaper tea. Imperial revenue continues flowing from the preserved towns and duty. But the legislation destroys the livelihood of every merchant who has built his business on tea importation and distribution from Boston to Charleston. Established traders discover that their customers can purchase superior products at lower prices directly from company agents who answer only to London directors. The commercial threat unites groups that have been divided on constitutional questions. Merchants who opposed earlier boycotts because they damaged trade relationships now face complete elimination from profitable commerce. Smugglers who ignored legal protests because they profited from illegal trade now confront company competition that makes their business unprofitable. Even moderate Americans who supported partial reconciliation with imperial authorities cannot ignore legislation that threatens their economic survival while rewarding their constitutional opponents. More ominously, the statute establishes a precedent for imperial monopolies that could extend to any branch of American commerce. If Westminster can grant the East India Company exclusive privileges in tea sales, why not give other London firms similar advantages in cloth, hardware, or agricultural products? The measure threatens to transform American merchants from independent traders into minor agents of metropolitan corporations, reducing provincial commerce to a branch of imperial business controlled entirely from London. The response begins in Philadelphia, where residents organize to prevent ships from entering port and unloading their controversial cargo. New York follows with similar preparations, while Charleston authorities allow landing but prevent sales by storing company tea in public warehouses. Each port develops tactics suited to local conditions, but all share the goal of making East India Company commerce impossible without directly attacking imperial sovereignty or private property. Boston's situation proves more complex than other ports because Governor Thomas Hutchinson, descendant of Anne Hutchinson, the religious dissenter, refuses to grant ships clearance to leave harbor without paying duties and unloading cargo. The Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver swing at anchor in Boston Harbor throughout December 1773, the holds full of tea that no one dares purchase, but that royal officials will not allow to leave. Each day that passes brings closer the deadline when customs officers will seize the cargo and sell it at public auction, achieving company goals through government action rather than voluntary commerce. Samuel Adams orchestrates the crisis with the skill of a master playwright. Mass meetings at Old South Church attract thousands of participants from Boston and surrounding towns, creating unprecedented displays of popular unity around constitutional principles. The meetings carefully avoid direct challenges to royal authority, while making clear that communities' sentiment overwhelmingly opposes tea sales under current conditions. Adams repeatedly emphasizes that Americans seek not to destroy property, but to prevent unconstitutional policies from taking effect through what appears to be normal commercial activity. The climax comes on December 16th, when the final deadline for resolving the tea crisis arrives without compromise from any party. Governor Hutchinson refuses to clear the ship's company. Agents declined to resign their commissions. Customs officials prepare to seize the cargo at dawn that evening, as 7,000 Americans pack Old South Church for what everyone understands may be the final peaceful assembly. Adams makes one last appeal for official cooperation in returning the tea to London, unsold. When word arrives that the governor maintains his refusal, Adams speaks the words that trigger the most famous act of civil disobedience in American history. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. Within minutes, men disguised as Mohawk Indians stream from the church toward Griffin's Wharf, where 3 tea ships wait in the gathering darkness, working by torchlight with remarkable discipline and efficiency. The empty 342 chests of East India Company tea into Boston Harbor, carefully replacing a single broken padlock and sweeping the ships clean before disappearing into the December night. The Boston Tea Party, as it becomes known to history, represents a new form of popular protest that carefully balances respect for property rights with rejection of unconstitutional policies. The participants damaged no ships, harm no persons, and steal no cargo. They even replace tea that accidentally spills into a participant's shoe. But they destroy property worth £10,000, a massive sum that demonstrates the seriousness of American constitutional objections while maintaining plausible claims of moral legitimacy. News of Boston's tea destruction spreads rapidly through the committees of correspondence, triggering celebrations in some ports and anxious discussions in others. American leaders understand that they have crossed a line from which retreat may prove impossible. Previous resistance efforts could be characterized as defensive responses to unconstitutional innovations. The tea destruction represents offensive action against established imperial authority, justified only by higher law claims that London officials will certainly reject the imperial response to exceeds even Samuel Adams' expectations for severity and scope. Lord North's ministry, convinced that American resistance reflects temporary passion rather than permanent principle, decides to make an example of Massachusetts that will deter similar actions elsewhere. The coercive legislation of 1774 immediately branded the intolerable measures by American propagandists, targets Boston specifically, but carries implications for all provincial communities that might consider following Massachusetts' example. The Boston Port Statute closes the harbor to all commerce until the destroyed tea is paid for and customs officers are compensated for their troubles. The Massachusetts government measure revokes the province's charter, placing appointment of council members and local officials under royal control, while severely restricting town meetings that have been the foundation of New England self-governance. The administration of justice statute allows royal officials charged with capital crimes to be tried in England rather than provincial courts, effectively granting immunity to imperial officers who might use deadly force against American protesters. The Quebec legislation, though not technically part of the coercive measures, arrives simultaneously and amplifies their threatening implications. The statute extends Quebec's boundaries south to the Ohio River, incorporating vast territories that Americans consider their natural inheritance from Victoria and the French and Indian War. More alarmingly, it establishes French civil law and Roman Catholic religious privileges throughout this expanded Quebec, terrifying Protestant Americans who view Catholicism as inherently hostile to English liberties and representative government. The coercive measures achieve the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of isolating Massachusetts as an example of the costs of resistance, they unite previously divided Americans around the principle that imperial authority directed against one province threatens the rights of all. If Westminster can revoke Massachusetts's charter, why not Pennsylvania's or Virginia's? If royal officials can escape local justice by fleeing to England, what protection do any Americans have against arbitrary authority? The measures transform a local dispute over tea sales into a continental crisis over the fundamental nature of imperial governance. The response emerges through the same networks that have coordinated resistance since the stamp crisis, but with new urgency and broader participation. Patience. The First Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia during September 1774, bringing together delegates from 12 provinces. Georgia abstains, unwilling to jeopardize imperial support for its conflicts with Native American tribes. For 7 weeks, 56 of America's most experienced political leaders debate questions that will determine whether constitutional disagreements can be resolved within existing imperial structures or require fundamental changes in the relationship between Britain and her American provinces. The Congress carefully balances radical demands for immediate resistance with moderate hopes for eventual reconciliation. The Continental Association establishes comprehensive non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption agreements that will pressure London through economic warfare while avoiding direct challenges to imperial sovereignty. Local committees throughout the continent will enforce these agreements, creating shadow governments that exercise authority parallel to, but separate from royal administration. More significantly, the Congress asserts American rights in language that moves beyond specific grievances toward general principles of governance. The Declaration of Rights claims for Americans all the liberties enjoyed by residents of Great Britain, including trial by jury protection against arbitrary searches and consent to taxation through elected representatives. The claims rest not merely on English legal precedent, but on natural law principles that apply to all human societies, regardless of particular historical circumstances. The Continental Association proves remarkably effective in mobilizing popular support for resistance while maintaining the appearance of peaceful protest. Local committees spring up in hundreds of communities, creating networks of political participation that extend far beyond traditional leadership groups. Farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers find themselves drawn into constitutional discussions that were previously confined to lawyers and politicians. The committees transform abstract arguments about parliamentary authority into practical decisions about daily consumption that every household must make. The association's enforcement mechanisms reveal how quickly constitutional resistance can develop coercive characteristics that mirror the arbitrary authority Americans claim to oppose. Committees publish names of merchants who violate non-importation agreements, subjecting them to social ostracism and economic boycotts. Suspected violators face interrogation and demands for public confessions that resemble the Star Chamber proceedings that English law supposedly prohibits. The line between popular justice and mob rule becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish, as committees enforce compliance with agreements that have no legal standing under existing colonial charters. Throughout the winter of 1774 to 1775, both sides prepare for confrontations that seem increasingly inevitable, despite continued hopes for peaceful resolution. In London, Lord North's ministry reinforces General Gage's Boston garrison while planning military expeditions to seize provincial military supplies stored in countryside magazines. American committees organize militia training and ammunition stockpiling, while maintaining official positions that they seek only to defend traditional rights within existing imperial structures. The powder alarms of late 1774 and early 1775 provide dress rehearsals for the larger conflict that approaches when royal troops march from Boston to remove gunpowder stored at Cambridge and Charlestown. Thousands of militia respond to alarm riders who spread word of imperial military action throughout eastern Massachusetts. The soldiers complete their missions without firing shots, but the popular response demonstrates that Americans can mobilize armed resistance faster than royal officials anticipated, and in larger numbers than imperial forces can immediately counter. These alarms also reveal the communications networks that Samuel Adams and other organizers have spent years developing. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and dozens of other writers carry news of imperial troop movements across New England within hours, allowing rapid coordination of responses across multiple provinces. The Committee of Safety stockpiles arms and ammunition while maintaining intelligence networks that monitor every movement of royal forces. By the spring of 1775, eastern Massachusetts resembles a province under military occupation by foreign forces, rather than a peaceful corner of the British Empire. The final alarm comes on the night of April 18, 1775, when General Gage orders Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith to march with 700 men to Concord, where provincial leaders have assembled a major military supply depot. The mission seems straightforward: seize or destroy the ammunition before it can be used against royal authority. Arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, if possible, and demonstrate that imperial forces retain the initiative in this escalating crisis. But Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott carry warning across the countryside faster than Smith's column can march by dawn on April 19th. Church bells and alarm guns have awakened militia companies throughout eastern Massachusetts. Hundreds of armed farmers converge on the route that royal troops must follow on their return to Boston, transforming what began as a simple supply raid into a running battle that will consume the next 8 years of American and British lives at Lexington Green, as the sun rises on a spring morning that will change the world. Captain John Parker arrays his 17 militia against Smith's advance guard. The two forces face each other across 100 yards of New England common British regulars trained for European warfare. American farmers defending their community against what they see as foreign invasion. Neither side intends to begin a revolution, but both understand that the constitutional crisis of the past decade has reached the point where words no longer suffice, and only arms can determine whether Americans will remain British subjects or become something new under the sun. Stand your ground, Parker tells his men. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin. Here, the shot that follows, fired by whom no one knows, echoes not just across Lexington Green, but around a world that will never again be quite the same. The age of revolution has begun, and its first battlefield lies in a small New England town where farmers have decided that some things matter more than peace, more than prosperity, more than life itself. The long argument over imperial authority and provincial rights has ended. Now comes 8 years of war. To determine whether the ideas that Americans have been discussing in assemblies and committees can survive the test of battle against the world's most powerful empire. The road to revolution, paved with good intentions and constitutional theories, has led to this moment when theory must give way to practice and arguments must yield to action. Everything that follows will be different, more dangerous, more costly, more uncertain, but also more decisive. The question is no longer whether Americans can remain loyal British subjects while maintaining their traditional rights. The question now is whether they can create a new form of government based on principles that most of the world considers impossible, dreams that all men are created equal, that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that people have not only the right, but the duty to alter or abolish governments that become destructive of the ends for which they were instituted. The American Revolution has begun. Captain John Parker's 70 Minutemen scatter across Lexington Green as Major John, Part 3D. Revolution ignites war. Without a country, Pitcairn advance guard approaches through the morning mist. 8 locals lie dead, 10 wounded, and the rest flee toward Concord as red-coated Marines reform their ranks. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith's column resumes its march, confident that a show of force has restored Westminster's authority over rebellious settlers. Behind them, riders gallop towards surrounding towns with news that will transform scattered militia companies into something resembling an army. Dr. Samuel Prescott reaches Concord ahead of the Metropolitan expedition, allowing patriots to disperse most military supplies before soldiers arrive. What the ministry troops discover disappoints them. A few musket balls, some wooden gun carriages, barrels of flour they mistake for gunpowder. Captain Walter Laurie's detachment burns the carriages at North Bridge, while Smith's main force searches homes and barns throughout the village from nearby hills. Concord militia watches smoke rise and assumes their town burns. Major John Buttrick leads 400 Minutemen down the slope toward North Bridge, as Laurie's men hurry to rejoin the main column at the bridge itself. Nervous soldiers fire warning shots that when two patriots return, volleys drop 3 redcoats, including Lieutenant Edward Thornton Good, the first Westminster casualty of what will become 8 years of war. Laurie's detachment retreats in disorder, while mainland militia, stunned by their success against professional soldiers, debate whether to pursue or simply defend their homes. Smith begins his return march at noon, unaware that alarm riders have spent 6 hours rousing the Massachusetts countryside from stone walls, farmhouses, and forest clearings. Militia companies converge on the route. His column must follow back to the port city. What began as a supply raid becomes a running battle, stretching 18 miles through territory that locals know intimately and visitors navigate with fatal difficulty. At Merriam's Corner, 2 miles from Concord Center, concealed marksmen opened fire on Smith's flanks, and rear soldiers trained for European battlefields struggle against an enemy that refuses formal combat while punishing every attempt at organized retreat. Officers fall to aimed shots from hunters who have spent lifetimes perfecting their marksmanship on game that provided dinner only when the first shot killed. Red-coated ranks thinned steadily. As the column stumbles towards safety that seems infinitely distant, Lord Hugh Percy's relief force from the port city finds Smith's survivors near Lexington, bloodied and demoralized by 7 hours of warfare, unlike anything their training had prepared them for. Percy's artillery scatters Patriot militia long enough for the combined forces to reorganize. But the retreat continues under constant harassment from an enemy that materializes from nowhere, strikes with deadly precision, then vanishes before retaliation becomes possible. By evening, when the last red-coated stragglers reach Charlestown Ferry, Westminster forces have suffered 300 casualties against fewer than 100 Patriot losses. More importantly, word of the day's events spreads through committee networks faster than official dispatches, reach London within weeks. Every mainland settlement knows that Massachusetts farmers have stood against the Empire's professional army and lived to tell the story. If New England's shepherds and shopkeepers can bloodied veteran soldiers, perhaps other regions can defend their liberties as well. News of Lexington and Concord transforms constitutional crisis into military emergency. Throughout the 13 provinces in Philadelphia, Second Continental Congress delegates, hurrying toward their scheduled May assembly, find themselves responsible for coordinating something approaching a war before they have legal authority to govern anything at all. Virginia's House of Burgesses votes to raise militia regiments while debating whether armed defiance constitutes rebellion or legitimate self-defense under English law. Connecticut patriots, led by Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen, seized Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, before London officials even learn of the fighting in Massachusetts. That dawn assault on May 10th captures the fortress without casualties, securing badly needed artillery while demonstrating that coordinated action between neighboring provinces remains possible, despite the absence of formal military alliance. Allen's demand that the sleeping commander surrender in the name of the great Jehovah, and the Continental Congress suggests that insurgent leaders have begun thinking in continental rather than merely provincial terms. Arnold, frustrated by Allen's theatrical leadership of the Ticonderoga expedition, continues north with a small force to capture Crown Point and St. John, extending Patriot control over the crucial Lake Champlain corridor that connects Canada to the Hudson Valley. His aggressive initiatives reveal both the opportunities and dangers facing insurgent forces. While successful surprise attacks can yield significant strategic advantages, they also escalate conflicts beyond the point where peaceful resolution remains achievable. Meanwhile, in the town on the Charles 15, Zalozan New England militia surround General Thomas Gage's garrison like an angry sea containing a single embattled island. The siege of the port city begins almost accidentally, as local companies that responded to April's alarms simply refused to go home, while red-coated soldiers occupy their regional capital. What starts as spontaneous protest gradually develops into systematic military investment that traps 4,000 Westminster troops in a city they supposedly control. Artemus Ward of Massachusetts assumes overall command of this improvised army, though his authority rests on little more than seniority and general consent among militia officers who recognize the need for coordination while jealously guarding their company's independence. Connecticut and Rhode Island regiments arrive to reinforce the siege, bringing different traditions of military organization that complicate efforts to establish unified command structures. Each province's forces operate according to familiar patterns, while slowly learning to cooperate with neighbors whose methods sometimes seem foreign. Gage faces impossible choices within his increasingly isolated garrison. Aggressive action against the surrounding militia might break the siege, but would certainly escalate the conflict beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. Defensive preparations suggest weakness, while consuming supplies that cannot easily be replaced. Negotiations within insurgent leaders might ease immediate pressures, but would implicitly recognize their authority and legitimize defiance that Westminster will never accept. Second Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia's State House on May 10th. While these military confrontations unfold 300 miles to the northeast, delegates from 12 provinces Georgia still hesitates to jeopardize London's support for its frontier conflicts, face questions that exceed their instruction and challenge their assumptions about proper relationships between colonies and mother country. How can they support Massachusetts while maintaining loyalty to the Crown? Can they coordinate military preparations without committing treason? Should they seek reconciliation or prepare for complete separation? John Adams arrives in Philadelphia, convinced that reconciliation has become impossible and that only independence can secure mainland liberties. His cousin Samuel, remaining in Massachusetts to coordinate military preparations, shares this assessment, but understands that most delegates still hope for peaceful resolution of constitutional disagreements. Moving too quickly towards separation might fragment the fragile unity that makes continental resistance possible. while moving too slowly might allow Westminster to suppress individual provinces before they can coordinate effective defense. Virginia's delegation, led by the imposing figure of George Washington, brings credibility and continental perspective that Massachusetts radicals desperately need. Washington's military experience in the French and Indian War, combined with his reputation for sound judgment and personal integrity, makes him a natural choice for senior military command. If Congress decides to assume responsibility for the forces surrounding the port city, more importantly, his Virginia origins ensure that Northern resistance cannot be dismissed as regional fanaticism. Debates in the State House reveal the fundamental tensions that will shape insurgent strategy throughout the coming conflict. Moderate delegates from Pennsylvania and New York seek policies that will pressure Westminster toward accommodation, while avoiding actions that might provoke irreversible escalation. Radical representatives from Massachusetts and Virginia argue that half measures will fail to secure liberty, while encouraging London to believe that sufficient pressure can restore colonial obedience. On June 15th, Congress resolves these tensions by appointing Washington as General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies, language that carefully avoids claiming independence while assuming responsibility for military forces that have no legal standing under existing colonial charters. His commission authorizes him to command troops from multiple provinces in defense of American liberty, terms that remain deliberately ambiguous about ultimate political objectives, while providing practical authority for immediate military necessities. Washington accepts command with characteristic humility, declining salary beyond expenses, and expressing doubt about his qualifications for such enormous responsibility. His farewell dinner with Philadelphia delegates reveals the magnitude of the task he has undertaken, transforming militia companies from different provinces with varying equipment and conflicting traditions into something resembling a professional army capable of sustained warfare against experienced European forces. Before Washington can reach Massachusetts, however, the siege erupts into the war's first major battle. General William Howe, recently arrived to reinforce Gage's garrison, decides that Patriot fortifications on Charlestown Peninsula must be eliminated before they render the port city untenable. His plan for June 17th calls for frontal assault against entrenchments that insurgent forces have spent the previous night constructing on Breed's Hill, a position that colonial maps call Bunker Hill, though the actual fighting will occur on the lower elevation closer to the harbor. Colonel William Prescott commands roughly 1,500 Patriot defenders, mostly Massachusetts farmers and artisans, who have never faced professional soldiers in formal battle. Their earthworks, hastily constructed during a single night, offer protection against small arms fire, but cannot withstand artillery bombardment that Howe's forces can deliver from ships in the harbor. Prescott understands that his men's only advantages are defensive position and superior marksmanship, benefits that will disappear if they allow themselves to be drawn into open combat. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," Prescott reportedly tells his troops. though the actual command probably came from several officers who understood that Patriot ammunition supplies could not sustain prolonged firefights. Whatever the exact words, the tactical principle remains clear: make every shot count, because there will not be enough powder for wasteful volleys like those that European armies exchange at long range. Howe's first assault sends red-coated ranks up the hill in perfect formation, bayonets gleaming in afternoon sunlight as drummers beat the advance at 60 yards. Patriot muskets erupt in carefully controlled volleys that shatter Westminster's front lines and send survivors stumbling back toward the beach. Bodies in red uniforms litter the slope like autumn leaves after a sudden storm, while insurgent defenders reload and wait for the next attack they know must come. A second assault produces similar results, with colonial marksmen again waiting until metropolitan soldiers reach close range before delivering devastating fire that breaks another charge before it can reach the earthworks. House officers begin to question whether any number of frontal attacks can succeed against defenders who shoot with such deadly accuracy from protected positions. Some suggest flanking movements or artillery preparation that might reduce Patriot advantages, but Howe insists that one more direct assault will surely carry the position. His third attack succeeds only because insurgent ammunition finally runs out after hours of sustained combat. Patriots fight with clubbed muskets, stones, and bare hands as redcoat soldiers finally reach their earthworks, but weight of numbers and professional training eventually prevail. Prescott orders retreat when further resistance becomes impossible, allowing his surviving troops to escape across Charlestown Neck, while Howe's battered forces claim possession of empty fortifications that have cost them over 1,000 casualties. Bunker Hill proves that mainland farmers and artisans can stand against the world's most professional army if they choose their ground carefully and fight with discipline equal to their patriotic enthusiasm. But the engagement also demonstrates the severe limitations facing insurgent forces' ammunition shortages, inadequate artillery, and command structures too informal for sustained operations against experienced enemies. Most soberly, retreat under fire requires training that militia companies have never received and cannot improvise on the battlefield conditions. Washington reaches Cambridge 2 weeks after the battle to find an army that exists more in congressional imagination than military reality. 16,000 men surround the port city, but they represent dozens of separate units with different equipment, varying terms of enlistment, and conflicting ideas about military discipline. Connecticut troops refused to accept orders from Massachusetts officers. Rhode Island companies demand different rations than their neighbors receive. New Hampshire regiments threaten to go home when their ammunition runs low. Creating unity from this diversity challenges Washington's diplomatic skills as much as his military experience. He must persuade men who consider themselves equals to accept hierarchical command structures that contradict their civilian assumptions about authority and consent. Provincial soldiers who elected their officers resist orders from commanders. They did not choose farmers, accustomed to seasonal rhythms cannot understand why military service requires year-round commitment, regardless of harvest schedules. Gradually, through personal example and careful attention to individual concerns, Washington begins molding his heterogeneous command into something approaching a continental army. Daily drills transform civilian militias into disciplined units capable of coordinated maneuvers. Standardized equipment and uniforms create visual symbols of unity that help soldiers think beyond provincial boundaries. Most importantly, shared hardships and common dangers forge bonds between men from different regions, who discover they can trust neighbors they previously knew only by reputation. While Washington organizes his army, Congress debates whether to seek reconciliation or prepare for complete separation from the empire. The Olive Branch Petition, drafted by John Dickinson and approved in July, represents moderate delegates' final attempt to restore harmony through direct appeal to King George III. The document acknowledges attachment to Your Majesty's person, family, and government, while requesting royal intervention to prevent further effusion of blood through parliamentary policies that violate traditional English liberties. But even as Congress approves this conciliatory gesture, it also issues a declaration of causes of taking up arms that adopts much more militant language. Thomas Jefferson and Dickinson's joint composition asserts that Americans are resolved to die freemen rather than live slaves, while stopping just short of declaring independence. The document warns that insurgent forces will fight until terms of peace shall be agreed upon that secure colonial rights within the empire or permit honorable separation from it. King George's response eliminates any remaining hopes for peaceful resolution. The proclamation of rebellion issued in August declares the provinces in open and avowed rebellion and authorizes military force to restore imperial authority. More ominously, the ministry begins recruiting German mercenaries to reinforce Westminster troops already in America, suggesting that London views this conflict as a foreign war rather than a domestic dispute requiring careful political management. News of Hessian recruitment reaches the mainland by autumn, hardening attitudes among moderates who previously supported reconciliation efforts. If the Crown treats loyal subjects like foreign enemies, why should those subjects maintain loyalty to a sovereign who denies their legitimate claims? German soldiers fighting in America will serve foreign interests rather than defending English liberties, making this struggle between competing visions of constitutional government rather than merely between authority and resistance. Congressional response comes through Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, published in January 1776. With the implicit blessing of radical delegates who understand that popular opinion must be prepared for the independence they increasingly view you as inevitable. Paine's plain language reaches audiences beyond the educated elites who have dominated political discourse, explaining complex constitutional arguments in terms that farmers, artisans, and laborers can easily understand. Society in every state is a blessing. The government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil, Paine writes, attacking not merely particular policies, but the entire principle of hereditary monarchy that places fallible human beings in positions of unlimited authority over their fellow creatures. His argument proceeds from philosophical first principles to practical considerations, demonstrating why American independence serves both justice and expediency, while reconciliation benefits neither the mainland nor the mother country. Common Sense sells 120 Zalozan copies within 3 months of publication, reaching readers in every province and social class. Payne donates his profits to support continental military preparations, making his pamphlet a contribution to the cause, as well as an argument for it. More importantly, his essay transforms the language of political debate from constitutional technicalities about parliamentary authority to fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the proper basis for governmental legitimacy. By spring 1776, military events have outpaced political discussions that once seemed urgent, but now appear increasingly irrelevant. Washington's army has forced Westminster troops to evacuate the port city, demonstrating that continental forces can achieve strategic objectives despite their obvious limitations. The failed invasion of Canada has shown that patriot ambitions extend beyond mere defensive measures to include offensive operations aimed at securing territorial advantages. Both sides have committed resources and shed blood in quantities that make peaceful reconciliation difficult to imagine. Richard Henry Lee's resolution, introduced in Congress on June 7th, finally addresses the fundamental question the delegates have been circling for over a year: that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Debate over Lee's motion reveals how far American thinking has evolved since the First Continental Congress carefully limited its demands to traditional rights within the existing imperial structure. Independence no longer seems like a radical departure from legitimate goals, but rather the logical culmination of principles that patriots have been defending since the stamp crisis. If Americans possess natural rights that no government can legitimately violate, why should they accept any authority that repeatedly transgresses those rights, regardless of its historical claims to their obedience? Thomas Jefferson, chosen to draft a formal declaration explaining American independence to a candid world, draws on philosophical traditions stretching back through John Locke to ancient Stoic writers who argued that political authority must rest on consent rather than force. His opening paragraphs establish universal principles that apply to all human societies, that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that people retain the right to alter or abolish governments that become destructive of their proper ends, and that revolution becomes not merely permissible, but obligatory, when peaceful remedies have been exhausted. The specific charges against King George III that comprise the Declaration's bulk catalogue, a decade of grievances that will be familiar to anyone who has followed the escalating crisis since 1765. But Jefferson's genius lies in presenting these particular complaints as illustrations of universal principles, rather than merely provincial resentments. American independence, in his formulation, serves the cause of human liberty everywhere, rather than simply defending the narrow interests of mainland settlers. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Jefferson writes that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words will echo through centuries of human struggle for dignity and freedom, inspiring movements that Jefferson himself cannot imagine. But in the summer of 1776, they serve the immediate purpose of justifying American independence in terms that reasonable people throughout the world can understand and support. Congress approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, creating the United States of America through words that transformed 13 separate rebellions into a single national revolution. Church bells ring throughout Philadelphia as delegates sign the document that makes them traitors to the crown they have served, and patriots to the country they have just created. The announcement spreads rapidly through post roads and shipping lanes that will carry news of American independence to every corner of an Atlantic world that must now adjust to the reality of a new nation, founded on principles that challenge the legitimacy of most existing governments. Washington orders the Declaration read to his troops in New York, where they have gathered to defend against the Westminster invasion that everyone expects will follow independence. As surely as thunder follows lightning, soldiers cheer the words that give meaning to their sacrifices, while officers contemplate the enormous task of defending a newborn republic against enemies who command the world's most powerful military forces. The United States exists in law and aspiration, but it must still prove itself worthy of survival in the harsh realm where nations live or die, according to their ability to defend their claims with force of arms. Independence transforms everything and nothing. Americans who were insurgent colonists yesterday become patriot citizens today, but they still face the same strategic challenges and military limitations that made victory seem unlikely under any name. Washington still commands an amateur army against professional enemies who enjoy overwhelming advantages in training, equipment, and experience. Congress still lacks reliable sources of revenue to finance the prolonged struggle that independence will require. But individual states still pursue local interests that sometimes conflict with continental necessities. But something fundamental has changed in the realm of human possibility. 13 separate provinces have declared themselves a single nation, based on principles that recognized no inherent superiority of birth, wealth, or social position. They have announced to the world that government exists to serve human happiness, rather than merely to maintain order and hierarchy. Most radically, they have claimed the right to create new political institutions, rather than simply inherit whatever arrangements history happens to provide. Whether these revolutionary principles can survive the test of war remains to be seen. The United States of America exists on paper, but it must still prove that a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, can long endure. In a world where most governments rest on very different foundations, that test will consume the next 7 years of American lives and determine whether the ideas proclaimed in Philadelphia during the summer of 1776 represent humanity's future, or merely an impossible dream that died when reality struck with overwhelming force. July 4th leaves no quarrel over taxes, no petition for redress. Henceforth, there is only the United States alive on paper, fighting for breath in the field. Independence proclaimed in Philadelphia's summer heat means little to Washington's Part 4 day. Darkest days, survival and sacrifice, soldiers shivering in New York's autumn winds. While Congress debates constitutional theory, the Patriot Army faces immediate reality. 32,000 Westminster troops, commanded by General William Howe, have landed on Staten Island with orders to crush American rebellion. Before it can spread beyond a few discontented provinces, against this professional force, Washington can field perhaps 20,000 men, most with minimal training and equipment that ranges from adequate to non-existent. Howe's strategy seems as overwhelming as his numbers. Control of New York Harbor would split New England from the other states, while providing a base for operations throughout the Hudson Valley. Coordinated with General Guy Carleton's anticipated advance from Canada, such a campaign could isolate radical Massachusetts from more moderate neighbors, who might yet be persuaded to abandon their revolutionary experiment. The city's merchants, many with loyalist sympathies, wait nervously to see whether their rebellion will prove more durable than their prosperity. Washington's Council of War faces impossible choices that illustrate the desperate circumstances confronting America's newborn republic. Defending Manhattan requires dividing already inadequate forces between multiple positions that enemy naval supremacy can isolate and destroy sequentially. Abandoning the city without a fight would demoralize patriots throughout the continent, while encouraging fence-sitters to accommodate themselves to what appears to be inevitable Westminster victory. Fighting and losing might prove worse than not fighting at all. The commander makes a fateful decision to defend everywhere, and thus defend nowhere, effectively. Patriots fortify Brooklyn Heights, Manhattan, Southern Tip, and various points along the Hudson River. Positions too far apart for mutual support, but collectively representing American determination to contest every inch of territory that liberty claims as its own against housed, concentrated professionals. This dispersal invites the kind of defeat that could end the rebellion before it truly begins. The Battle of Long Island on August 27th confirms Washington's worst fears about amateur soldiers facing European veterans. Howe's flanking maneuver through Jamaica Pass catches Continental defenders completely by surprise, rolling up their left wing while frontal attacks pinned down troops who might otherwise escape encirclement. General John Sullivan's and Lord Stirling's men fight courageously, but uselessly against overwhelming numbers, positioned to exploit every tactical mistake that inexperience produces under combat stress. Maryland troops, commanded by Stirling, sacrifice themselves to buy time for the main army's escape. Charging again and again against impossible odds, while their comrades retreat toward Brooklyn's fortifications. The Maryland 400 enter American legend as men who died to preserve a revolution. They would not live to see triumph, though most die unknown and unremembered, except by families who never learn exactly how their sons, fathers, and brothers gave their lives for liberty. Washington himself narrowly escapes capture, while rallying troops whose confidence dissolves under their first taste of military disaster. Rebel soldiers, trained for months in siege warfare around the port city, discover that drilling and actual combat require entirely different skills. Officers who seemed competent during peaceful preparations prove inadequate when decisions must be made under fire, while men die for their mistakes. The army that proclaimed independence with such confidence in July limps back to Manhattan in August, bloodied and demoralized. Worse than military defeat, Long Island reveals the fragility of popular support for revolutionary government. Under pressure, Long Island farmers, faced with occupying troops who demand loyalty oaths, discover that abstract principles matter less than immediate security for families and property. Merchants who applauded independence when it seemed costless begin calculating whether continued defiance serves their interests. When Westminster forces control local commerce, the revolution must prove itself worthy of sacrifice. But early evidence suggests it may demand more than most people are prepared to give. Howe's methodical advance at Manhattan Island through September and October demonstrates professional military competence that amateur opposition cannot match at Harlem Heights. American troops achieve a minor tactical success that briefly restores morale, but strategic realities remain unchanged. Westminster forces control the rivers, possess overwhelming numerical superiority, and can choose when and where to fight battles that American commanders must accept or abandon their positions entirely. Fort Washington's surrender in November epitomizes the disasters that follow when Republican enthusiasts confront imperial professionals. Despite its name, the fortress proves indefensible against coordinated assault by land and water. Yet American commanders convince themselves that patriotic determination can substitute for adequate preparation and realistic strategy. When Hessian troops stormed the works, they captured nearly 3,000 rebel soldiers whose loss leaves Washington with barely enough men to constitute an army. Retreat across New Jersey becomes a race against time as the Patriot Army dissolves through desertion, expiring enlistments, and sheer exhaustion. Towns that welcomed liberators in 1775 closed their doors to what appears to be a beaten rabble fleeing superior forces. Farmers who contributed supplies during the hopeful early months now hide their grain and livestock from soldiers who look more like brigands than defenders of liberty. The cause that seemed so promising when proclaimed in Philadelphia appears to be dying along the muddy roads leading toward Pennsylvania. Thomas Paine marches with the retreating army and chronicles its agony in words that capture both despair and defiance. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. his second crisis pamphlet, written by campfire light and published throughout the states, reminds Americans that liberty has always required sacrifice and that present sufferings serve future happiness. Crossing into Pennsylvania in December, Washington commands fewer than 3,000 defective troops from an army that once numbered over 20,000. Enlistments expire at year's end, threatening to reduce his force even further, just when the revolution needs every available defender. Local militia called out to reinforce American troops often arrive without weapons, ammunition, or sufficient clothing for winter campaigning. The United States of America, 6 months after declaring independence, teeters on the edge of military collapse. Congress flees Philadelphia for Baltimore as Howe's advance threatens the capital, where independence was proclaimed. Representatives who voted boldly for separation in July's heat now face December's cold reality. The revolutions require more than inspiring rhetoric to survive contact with enemy armies. Some delegates begin discussing terms for negotiated surrender, while others insist that retreat merely represents temporary setback, rather than permanent defeat. Loyalist strength emerges throughout the Middle States as Westminster forces demonstrate their ability to protect supporters while punishing rebels. New Jersey families who remain neutral while the war's outcome seemed uncertain now declare for the crown when rebel defeat appears inevitable. Local committees that enforce non-importation agreements and patriotic conformity discover that their authority evaporates when enemy troops patrol nearby roads. Hessian mercenaries compound American difficulties by introducing foreign elements into what many still view as a civil war between kinsmen. These professional soldiers, fighting for wages rather than principle, show little concern for the property rights and personal sensitivities that might restrain Westminster troops with family connections in America. Their presence transforms the struggle from a constitutional dispute within the imperial family into something resembling a foreign conquest. Yet adversity also reveals strength that prosperity had hidden throughout the states. Local communities organize relief for rebel soldiers and support for their families. Women assume responsibility. 'Tis previously reserved for men managing farms and businesses while their husbands serve in the army. Children too young for military service contribute by manufacturing ammunition, gathering intelligence, and maintaining communications between isolated patriot communities. African Americans face particularly complex choices as revolutionary principles collide with social realities that deny them the liberty that white patriots claim as their birthright. Some join the Patriot Army, hoping that military service will earn recognition of their humanity and rights. Others support Westminster forces after promises of freedom for slaves who abandoned rebel masters. The contradiction between revolutionary ideals and revolutionary practice creates opportunities for Black Americans to advance their own liberation, regardless of which side ultimately triumphs. Native American tribes generally support Westminster forces, calculating that London's imperial authority offers better protection against frontier expansion than do revolutionary governments controlled by land-hungry settlers. This alliance provides Britain with valuable military assets, while forcing American commanders to defend multiple frontiers simultaneously. Indian raids on exposed settlements drained resources needed for the main war, while demonstrating that independence may cost more than most patriots initially imagined. Religious communities struggle with conflicting loyalties as war forces choices between spiritual principles and political commitments. Quakers committed to pacifism find their communities divided between those who support the revolution through military contributions and those who view any assistance to war making as a violation of divine law. Anglican clergy, many educated in England and financially dependent on church connections, generally counsel loyalty to established authority, while their congregations increasingly embrace resistance. News of Trenton reaches the States during the darkest period of the war, when many Americans have concluded that independence was a noble dream. That reality has shattered beyond repair. Washington's Christmas night crossing of the Delaware River in a blizzard, followed by surprise attack on Hessian forces celebrating their holiday, demonstrates that American troops retain fighting spirit despite months of defeats and retreats. The small victory yields minimal strategic advantage, but enormous psychological benefit for a cause that desperately needs evidence that ultimate triumph remains possible. Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery supports Washington's assault, while young James Monroe suffers wounds that will mark him for life. Future President and future Treasury Secretary served together in ranks that include farmers from Pennsylvania, fishermen from Massachusetts, and mechanics from New York. The Patriot Army becomes a school for Republican citizenship, where men from different states learn to cooperate across regional boundaries while defending principles that apply to all Americans, regardless of their provincial origins. Princeton's follow-up victory a week later confirms that Trenton represented more than a lucky accident. American troops again demonstrate ability to move rapidly, strike effectively, and withdraw before enemy reinforcements can arrive. General Hugh Mercer's death in the fighting reminds patriots that victory requires blood, but his sacrifice helps purchase strategic success that stabilizes New Jersey while encouraging wavering allies throughout the continent. Winter quarters at Morristown provide American troops with the first respite they have enjoyed since the campaign began. But hardships continue to test revolutionary determination. Rebel soldiers lack adequate clothing, food, and shelter, while serving a government that possesses little money and less credit. Pay arrives irregularly, if at all, forcing men to choose between patriotic duty and family responsibilities. That revolution cannot suspend. Some desert to tent farms or seek civilian employment that pays wages in real currency, rather than continental promises. Nathaniel Greene emerges as Washington's most trusted subordinate commander during these difficult months, demonstrating administrative skills and strategic thinking that will prove crucial in later campaigns. His Southern background provides geographical knowledge, while his Quaker origins offer moral authority that helps bridge religious divisions within patriot ranks. Greene understands that amateur armies succeed through endurance rather than tactical brilliance, learning to avoid battles that risk everything, while seeking engagements that advance long-term objectives. Henry Knox's epic winter journey from Fort Ticonderoga delivers artillery that transforms Patriot capabilities while demonstrating logistical innovation that European armies rarely attempt. Dragging 59 cannons 300 miles through snow and ice requires improvisation and determination that professional soldiers might consider impossible. Knox's success proves that American resourcefulness can sometimes substitute for conventional military assets, while providing siege weapons that will prove essential in future operations. British strategy begins to shift, as Howe recognizes that military victories alone cannot restore imperial authority over populations committed to independence. Conquering territory proves meaningless if inhabitants remain hostile and ready to resume rebellion whenever opportunity arises. London policymakers gradually realize that suppressing American independence will require resources and commitments that exceed what domestic politics can sustain indefinitely. French interest in American independence intensifies as Benjamin Franklin begins his diplomatic mission in Paris, though formal alliance remains months away. Virginia's and other ministry officials calculate that American success would weaken Britain while advancing French interests, but they hesitate to commit resources to what might prove a losing cause. Secret aid flows to Patriot forces through commercial channels that preserve official neutrality. While testing American military potential, Valley Forge looms ahead as winter quarters, where the Patriot Army will either forge itself into an effective fighting force or dissolve under pressures that have already reduced it to a barely functioning remnant of its original strength. Washington's correspondence reveals his understanding that 1778 must bring decisive changes, either foreign assistance that tilts the balance toward American success, or military improvements that allow Patriot forces to compete effectively against professional enemies, or political developments that restore popular enthusiasm for independence. As 1777 draws to a close, the American Revolution hangs by a thread so slender that slight changes might snap them entirely. The United States exists in Lowell, but not yet in fact, claimed by a Congress that governs little and defended by an army that possesses more courage than capacity. Independence proclaimed so confidently 18 months earlier now seems like a desperate gamble that may bankrupt everyone foolish enough to stake their lives and fortunes on its success. But something fundamental has changed in American consciousness that cannot easily be reversed, regardless of military outcomes. Ordinary people have discovered that they can organize effective resistance against imperial authority while maintaining civil order and economic productivity. Local communities have learned to govern themselves without external direction while cooperating with neighbors to achieve common objectives. Most importantly, Americans have begun to imagine political possibilities that transcend inherited arrangements and create new institutions based on popular consent rather than traditional authority. Whether these revolutionary changes in human consciousness can survive military defeat remains to be seen. the Patriot Army retreats toward winter quarters that may become its graveyard, while Congress debates in exile whether to continue resistance or seek a negotiated settlement. British forces control most major ports, while loyalist militia emerge throughout the countryside. By conventional measures, the rebellion appears doomed. Yet revolutions succeed or fail according to different standards than conventional wars. Ideas once planted in human minds prove remarkably difficult to eradicate through military force alone. The principles proclaimed in Philadelphia have taken root throughout American society in ways that mere defeat cannot easily undo. Independence may yet survive the winter that threatens to kill the army that defends it. Preserved in the hearts and minds of people who have glimpsed possibilities that transform how they understand government, liberty, and their own place in the world. Snow begins falling at Valley Forge as Washington's Part 5e. Turning the tide, Saratoga and the world stage ragtag host settles into winter quarters that will either temper it into a professional weapon or shatter what remains of organized resistance. Yet 300 miles to the north, events already underway are about to turn this uprising from a provincial revolt into a global confrontation that will upset the balance of power on 4 continents. General John Burgoyne marches south from Canada with 7,000 redcoats, Hessians and native allies. Certain his well-choreographed invasion will cleave New England from the other states. Like a surgeon's scalpel on London maps, his design appears flawless. Push down Lake Champlain to Albany, rendezvous with Conal Bar, St. Leger advancing from Oswego, and with General Howe driving up the Hudson. The converging blades, Westminster believes, will crush rebel resistance in the valley and prove the Empire can still execute complex operation. Despite America's untamed landscape, Fort Ticonderoga falls on 5 July 1777, vindicating metropolitan optimism. The stronghold snatched so dramatically by Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen 2 years earlier, capitulates almost without a shot. Once Royal Gunners haul cannon onto Mount Defiance, General Arthur Street, Clare withdraws in haste, leaving wagons of provisions that Burgoyne's column sorely needs for the wilderness trek toward Albany. The triumph, however, becomes a millstone. Chasing St. Clair eats precious weeks, and word of Ticonderoga is lost. Flashes through New England's alarm network, spurring farmers who might have stayed neutral to take up arms. Nothing rallies local resolve more quickly than proof that royal bayonets can stab deep into land. Patriots consider their birthright. Burgoyne's procession into the interior exposes the fatal flaw in London's scheme, applying European logistics to North American woods. His enormous baggage train, perfectly ordinary on the continent, turns into an anchor on roads that must be hacked from forest and bridged with felled trees. Colonial axemen drop pines across the route, while local bands pepper every foraging party. 20 miles of track consumed nearly a month. Settlers drive off livestock, torched grain, and leave only bare hearths for the invaders. What started as an imperial parade now resembles a desperate slog. Manpower and material bleeding away faster than any musket volley could manage. General Philip Schuyler exploits the terrain brilliantly, declining set-piece battles and instead drawing Burgoyne ever deeper, while sapling-sharp militia shadow the column farther west. St. Leger's wing stalls at Fort Stanwix, where Colonel Peter Gansevoort refuses to surrender. The siege drags on. Relief militia under Nicholas her command are ambushed at Oriskany in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Mortally wounded, her command props himself against a tree, calmly issues orders, and smokes his pipe. His combat rages. Enter Benedict Arnold with a handful of regulars and a talent for psychological warfare. He scatters rumors of thousands of reinforcements, stalking the woods. Native auxiliaries melt away, and St. Leger's expedition collapses. South of the Hudson, Howe decides fatally to sail for Philadelphia instead of marching north. Burgoyne, unaware he has been abandoned, plods on his bid to plunder supplies. The Bennington crashes into John Stark's New Hampshire, men crying will beat him today. Or Molly Stark sleeps a widow tonight. Nearly 1,000 Imperials are lost. Casualties. Burgoyne can ill afford. Meanwhile, at Valley Forge, Baron Friedrich von Steuben begins overhauling Washington's ranks. The flamboyant Prussian drills the men relentlessly yet respectfully, crafting discipline compatible with Republican sensibility. Officers learn to earn authority. Privates grasp the cadence of synchronized volleys. Command in the North passes from Schuller to Horatio Gates in August, just as thousands of short-term militia stream to the colors. For once, rebel numbers surpass the professionals. Burgoyne presses on regardless. At Freeman's Farm on the 19th of September, his bayonets seize the field, but bleed heavily. Arnold's dash and Daniel Morgan's riflemen sting the red line, repeatedly proving American troops can trade fire with veterans in open ground. The showdown arrives at Bemis Heights on the 7th of October. Gates prefers a defensive grind. Yet Arnold, riding like a fury despite having been relieved of command, leads a furious counterstrike. Simon Fraser falls to marksman Timothy Murphy's long shot. The Imperial flank buckles, and dusk finds Burgoyne reeling. 10 days later, near the hamlet of Saratoga, the beleaguered British general surrenders his entire force. The Convention Army lays down arms. Muskets, cannon and powder change hands, along with a surge of confidence money can't buy. Dispatches. Race to Paris. Franklin, lounging in plain Quaker gray, needs no embellishment. Victory speaks for itself. On the 6th of February, 1778, France signs the Treaty of Alliance. Spain and the Dutch Republic will follow. The conflict instantly widens to the Caribbean, Gibraltar, even India, forcing Britain to defend an overstretched empire on multiple fronts. Back in Europe, Catherine the Great champions the League of Armed Neutrality, hobbling British efforts to police the seas. Meanwhile, American privateers and John Paul Jones chew at British commerce. Insurance rates skyrocket. Spring finds Dubai's newly honed battalions leaving Valley Forge. They march in step, by the manual, and trust the line instead of the tree. French frigates prowl the Atlantic, and Marquis de Lafayette returns with word that a fleet and an army will soon follow. The tide has turned, but shoals remain. Redcoats still hold key ports. Loyalist rangers raid the back country, and southern plantations have yet to feel the war's full heat. Allied courts pursue their own agendas, and American unity is forever fragile. Saratoga was the hinge. The door to victory is open, not yet secured. Independence now rides on international coalitions and a citizen soldiery tempered by hardship. The world truly has turned upside down, but it has not yet come to rest. Part 6. The Southern Strategy, Fire, and Betrayal. Clinton's War Council gathered in New York through the winter of 1778, wrestling with the new reality that Saratoga had made it impossible to ignore. Northern drives had bled veteran regiments white, while gaining little more than proof that New England farmers would fight like cornered wolves whenever their liberties were threatened. With France now formally aligned to the rebellion, the struggle had leapt from a colonial insurrection to a globe-spanning conflict, stretching imperial resources to the breaking point. Yet surrender was unthinkable for a kingdom that measured its very identity by the reach of its empire. Out of those grim calculations emerged the last desperate throw of the dice. The Southern Strategy. British intelligence insisted that loyalty to the crown ran stronger below the Potomac than it ever had in the North. Wealthy rice and indigo planters in Georgia and South Carolina, bound to slavery for their prosperity, supposedly feared social upheaval far more than political separation. London reasoned that if royal armies could reclaim the lower provinces and rally these cautious elites, the rebellion might be rolled back province by province until New England was once more isolated and exhausted. Lord George Germain embraced the plan with enthusiasm, revealing how poorly Whitehall grasped Southern complexities. From his vantage in London's War Office, the region looked orderly, hierarchical, and therefore salvageable. Surely pragmatic landowners would prefer reconciliation with the Crown to dependence on Massachusetts radicals, whose egalitarian rhetoric threatened planter supremacy. Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell's expedition proved at first that Germain's optimism wasn't entirely baseless. On Christmas 1778, he stormed Savannah, and George's patriot government collapsed in a matter of days. Local loyalists surfaced overnight, and thousands rushed to swear allegiance. Once red uniforms patrolled the streets. The fall of Savannah looked like the first link in a chain that would choke the rebellion into submission. Yet those early successes carried a hidden curse. Formal victory on the coast did nothing to quell the backcountry, where resistance vanished into pine barrens and swamps, the way mist slips between cypress trunks. Patriot detachments melted into the landscape they knew by heart, returning to strike wagon trains, patrols, and isolated pickets before dissolving again into the canebrakes. The British Army, drilled for European set-piece battles, found itself chasing ghosts. Charleston became the ultimate test of the strategy. In early 1780, Sir Henry Clinton sailed south with more than 8,000 regulars, determined to seize the richest port in the South and break the Patriot War effort in a single stroke. The siege was textbook entrenchments, gun batteries, trench parallels creeping closer each night. General Benjamin Lincoln, cornered within the city's sandy ramparts, commanded nearly 6,000 mixed state and continental defenders, but no relief army could penetrate the ring of bayonets and broadsides. On 12th May, Charleston capitulated, the largest surrender of American arms in the war. London celebrated the ministry, declared the rebellion backbroken, but inside the triumph lurked a poison seed. British authority now had to be lived with, not merely proclaimed, and restoring royal order meant relying on local loyalists who were often more eager for vengeance than for reconciliation. One such instrument was beneath Tarleton. At 26, his green-jacketed legion galloped across the Carolina Low Country, sabers flashing and torches setting barns ablaze. He believed terror would cow rebels back into submission instead. His refusal to accept surrender at Waxhaw on the 29th May, where wounded men were cut down after throwing their muskets aside, turned bloody Bane into the devil of patriot nightmares. Mothers whispered his name to frighten children. Men rode to join militia companies, swearing they would never ask quarter from dragoons who gave none if Tarleton was terror. Francis Marion was invisibility. The wiry South Carolinian, soon christened the Swamp Fox, struck convoys, liberated prisoners, and disappeared into the dark water labyrinth of the PD. Plantation overseers loyal to the king now slept uneasily, knowing Marion's riflemen could appear from any palmetto thicket farther inland. Thomas Sumter, the Carolina Gamecock, rallied hard, riding partisans who fought with tomahawks as readily as muskets. Sumter's men ambushed outposts along the Santee, then melted into the Pine Hills before British reinforcements arrived in London's War Office. The reports blurred into a litany. Supply depot burned. Courier intercepted. Loyalist column wiped out. Outpost abandoned. Controls seemed to shrink to the soil. Garrison boots actually touched, and sometimes not even that. Redcoat sentries joked that the night itself fought for the rebels. Desperate to smash this hydra of local resistance, Clinton empowered Charles Cornwallis with sweeping authority. The Earl was everything London admired: brave, relentless, confident in discipline, force. Yet he confronted a foe that refused to stay put long enough to be destroyed. When he chased Sumter into the back country, Marion struck near Yorktown. When Tarleton burst into a militia camp, the rebels simply scattered and reformed 2 counties away. To knit chaos into strategy, the Americans turned to Major General Nathaniel Greene, a Rhode Island Quaker whose calm, masked iron endurance taking command in October 1780. Greene surveyed the chessboard and chose a patient game. Stretch Cornwallis until his columns thinned, then strike when least expected. Greene split his army. He sent Daniel Morgan, a hulking Virginian with a gravel voice and a knack for intuitive tactics, westward to menace Tory strongholds near the Broad River. Cornwallis dispatched Tarleton to hunt him down. The chase ended at Cowpens on 17 January 1781, when Morgan engineered a tactical masterpiece. Militia fired 2 deliberate volleys, feigned panic, and drew British regulars into a hollow lined with Continental bayonets. When Morgan unleashed a double envelopment, Charlton's legion shattered. London lost 900 seasoned soldiers. The American casualty list barely topped 70. Humiliated but unbowed, Cornwallis burned his baggage to move faster, vowing to corner Greene before his foe could escape across North Carolina. The 2 armies danced a brutal waltz called the Race to the Dan. Greene's men, ragged, shoeless, fueled by scant rations, slipped across icy rivers hours ahead of pursuers. Cornwallis, deprived of supply wagons, and forced to subsist off a countryside, already stripped by foragers, blood men daily to disease and exhaustion. When Greene finally offered battle at Guilford Courthouse on March 15, 1781, Cornwallis believed he'd found the decisive clash he craved. Tactically, he was right. The field belonged to the king's army. When the smoke cleared strategically, he had purchased that ground with a quarter of his strength. Losses Britain could afford. 8 years into an exhausting war, Greene, though beaten, had survival in hand. "We fight, get beat, rise and fight again," he wrote. Congress. And he proved it by pivoting south into South Carolina, while Cornwallis, bruised and low on supplies, angled north into Virginia, seeking reinforcements. Southern Loyalists, watching the king's army vanish into the distance, suffered a collective chill of doubt, with redcoats gone. They faced Marion's and Sumter's rage alone. Skirmish by skirmish fought by Fort Greene and his partisan allies, retook the interior. By summer's end, only Charleston and Savannah remained in British hands, isolated coastal islands of red in a sea of rebel green. Meanwhile, Virginia reeled from new blows. Benedict Arnold, freshly minted British brigadier after his treason at West Point, ravaged the James River in early 1781, torching tobacco warehouses and shipyards. Arnold's raid, though minor, militarily struck at patriot morale proof that the Revolution could birth traitors of the highest rank. Arnold's presence in Virginia drew the Marquis de Lafayette into a cat-and-mouse campaign north of the James Lafayette Slender Franco. American corps ducked and dodged the combined armies of Arnold. Then Cornwallis, never risking destruction but forever spoiling British foraging. By July, Cornwallis had orders to secure a deep-water base on the Chesapeake. He chose Yorktown, fortifying its sandy bluffs with redoubts and earthworks. But he could not know what no one in London could foresee was that too independent Franco. American plans were converging on him. Like thunderheads north of the Hudson, Washington and Rochambeau calculated a bold stroke. March. The Allied army from New York to Virginia masked their movement with deception. And if the French fleet could win temporary control of the Chesapeake trap, Cornwallis on his peninsula. Admiral de Grasse, sailing from the West Indies with 28 ships of the line, promised precisely that. Back in South Carolina, partisan war ground on with unrelenting cruelty. Loyalist and patriot neighbors burned each other's barns, hanged prisoners from oak limbs, and shot wounded men on doorsteps. The Revolution's high ideals recited in Philadelphia parlors drowned here in ash and blood. Women ran estates, smuggled messages, and comforted refugees. Enslaved Africans, courted by both armies with promises of liberty, weighed the chance of freedom against the certainty of capture and punishment. Native nations, especially the Cherokee and Creek, struck frontier settlements to halt settler encroachment, transforming the southern backwoods into a theater of three-way war. In September, the Grasses cannon thundered at the Battle of the Capes, driving a British relief squadron back to New York and sealing Yorktown by sea. A fortnight later, Washington's and Rochambeau columns, linked with Lafayette hemming Cornwallis behind ramparts, he suddenly realized, were prison walls. For 3 weeks, Allied artillery ground, Yorktown to Rebel, Redoubt 9 fell to French bayonets. Redoubt 10 to Alexander Hamilton's night charge, where Virginians, New Yorkers, and free black sappers stormed parapets together. Cornwallis, his lines collapsing, attempted a desperate river escape, thwarted when a squall scattered his boats like leaves. On the 19th of October, 1781, the Earl surrendered more than 7,000 troops. British drummers beat a march called the World, turned upside down as ranks stacked muskets, before lines of ragged American and immaculate French soldiers. Yorktown did not end the war at a stroke, but it broke the Southern strategy beyond repair. London still held Savannah and Charleston, but their garrisons now stared anxiously seaward, waiting for French masts to crest the horizon. Loyalist morale cratered. Thousands fled with the redcoats when evacuation orders finally came. Plantation aristocrats, once tempted by British overtures, now hedged every bet, negotiating quietly with state officials to protect their wealth in a patriot future. Fire and betrayal had tested the revolution's sinews without snapping them through swamp skirmish and plantation raid. Through Cowpens, Kings Mountain, Guilford, and Yorktown, Americans learned that a people defending their own soil could bleed a global empire dry by refusing to break. The South lay battered, its fields scorched, and its families divided. But from that crucible emerged a deeper understanding of the costs and the worth of liberty. The king's dice had rolled, rattled, and come up short. Now the United States stood on the shoreline of victory, bruised yet unbowed, ready to claim the harvest sown in sacrifice. Part 70. Victory at Yorktown, a world turned upside down. Summer heat shimmers over Virginia's tidewater rivers. As Cornwallis settles his army into Yorktown, confident that this tobacco port offers the secure base that has eluded him throughout his exhausting campaigns in the Carolinas. From here, he can threaten Patriots' supply lines while maintaining communication with Clinton's forces in New York through naval routes that Westminster still controls. The Earl believes he has finally positioned his troops where their professional advantages can decisively influence the war's outcome. Yet even as redcoats fortify the bluffs overlooking the York River, forces beyond Cornwallis knowledge converge to create the trap that will end metropolitan hopes for suppressing American independence. In Newport, Rhode Island, Rochambeau French army prepares for the march that will unite European professionalism with continental determination. Off the Virginia Capes, Admiral de Grasse, his fleet sails north from the Caribbean, carrying reinforcements whose arrival will transform strategic possibilities throughout the Chesapeake region. Washington's headquarters at New Windsor buzzes with activity as the commander and his staff plan the campaign that might finally achieve decisive victory over enemies who have seemed invincible. Despite years of defeats and setbacks, the Virginian understands that opportunity rarely offers second chances, particularly when success depends on coordinating land and sea operations across hundreds of miles of territory, where communication failures could destroy carefully laid plans. Everything must work perfectly, for the war might drag on for years with no certainty of ultimate success. Intelligence reports from Lafayette confirm that Cornwallis remains committed to his Yorktown position. Despite growing evidence that French naval support threatens to isolate his army from seaborne reinforcement, the young Marquis has spent months maneuvering his small force through Virginia's interior, avoiding decisive engagement while gathering information about enemy dispositions and intentions. His reports provide Washington with detailed knowledge of terrain, enemy strength, and local resources that will prove crucial during the coming siege. Rochambeau's march from Rhode Island demonstrates the logistical sophistication that French military organization brings to operations that continental forces could never attempt independently. His 4,000 troops move with precision that European armies take for granted, but that Americans still find remarkable, their supply trains efficiently managed and their routes carefully planned to avoid unnecessary delays. The Count himself proves a diplomatic commander whose tact smooths over inevitable friction between allies, whose military traditions differ significantly. Philadelphia citizens line the streets as Allied armies parade through the capital, where independence was proclaimed 5 years earlier. Continental soldiers, now disciplined veterans whose bearing reflects von Steuben training, march alongside French regulars whose white uniforms and professional equipment epitomize European military excellence. The symbolism strikes observers forcefully. America's citizen soldiers have earned respect as equals from the world's finest military forces. Yet beneath this surface harmony, tensions persist that remind participants that allies remain foreigners whose ultimate interests may not perfectly align with American goals. French officers, accustomed to aristocratic deference, sometimes struggle with republican informality that treats merit above birth. Continental commanders, jealous of their hard-won authority, occasionally resent foreign expertise that implies their own inadequacy. Only shared commitment to defeating common enemies prevents these cultural differences from undermining military cooperation. The Grass's arrival in the Chesapeake during late August transforms strategic calculations throughout the theater by establishing French naval supremacy in waters that Westminster has controlled since the war began. His 28 ships of the line dwarfed any fleet that local enemy commanders can assemble, while their crews include veterans of Caribbean operations where French seamanship has repeatedly demonstrated superiority over individual metropolitan vessels. For the first time, Patriot forces will enjoy naval support during major operations. Admiral Thomas Graves's fleet from New York attempts to restore Westminster maritime control through the September 5th Battle of the Virginia Capes, but French tactical superiority proves decisive in an engagement that determines the entire campaign's outcome. The Grass's line maintains formation while delivering concentrated fire that damages enemy vessels without suffering comparable losses. Graves withdraws toward New York after failing to break through French positions, abandoning Cornwallis to whatever fate land operations might determine. Siege preparations begin immediately as Allied engineers, led by French specialists whose expertise reflects generations of European fortress warfare, design investment lines that will systematically reduce Yorktown defenses through scientific methods rather than costly assault. The trenches advance according to established principles that balance engineering efficiency with tactical security, creating protected approaches that allow artillery to dominate enemy positions while minimizing casualties among attacking forces. Alexander Hamilton commands one of the assault columns that capture British advanced redoubts during the October 14th night attack that breaks Cornwallis' outer defensive line. The former aide-de-camp, eager to prove his courage in combat rather than merely staff work, leads his men across obstacles that enemy engineers have constructed to channel attacks into killing zones. His success, coordinated with similar French operations against adjacent positions, demonstrates that Allied cooperation extends to the tactical level, where personal courage determines immediate outcomes. Artillery bombardment intensifies as American and French guns, positioned in captured advanced works, deliver concentrated fire that makes Yorktown's streets uninhabitable, while destroying buildings that provide shelter for defending troops. The siege follows European precedents that emphasize systematic reduction of enemy resistance through superior firepower, rather than dramatic gestures that waste lives without achieving decisive results. Each day brings the defending garrison closer to the point where further resistance becomes impossible. Cornwallis attempts a desperate breakout across the York River during the night of October 16th, hoping to escape encirclement by abandoning heavy equipment while preserving his army's human assets for future operations. The plan requires perfect coordination and favorable weather conditions that nature refuses to provide. Violent storms scatter the boats needed for evacuation, while Allied sentries detect movement that threatens to transform organized withdrawal into chaotic slaughter. Dawn on October 17th reveals the hopelessness of Cornwallis' position as Allied artillery resumes bombardment that the garrison can no longer effectively answer. Ammunition stocks run dangerously low, while casualties mount among troops, whose morale finally breaks under pressures that professional discipline can no longer contain. Single drummer boy appears on the ramparts, beating parley, while a white flag signals the Earl's readiness to discuss surrender terms that will end 4 years of Southern warfare. Negotiation proceeds with courtesy that reflects 18th century military conventions, though underlying tensions remind participants that this war has sometimes violated traditional rules governing conflict between civilized opponents. Washington insists that surrender ceremonies accord American forces the same honors granted to their French allies, establishing diplomatic precedent that recognizes the United States as an equal participant rather than merely a French client. The distinction matters enormously for a nation whose international standing remains fragile despite military success. October 19th, 1781 dawns clear and cool as Allied armies form ranks for the ceremony that will eliminate Westminster's last major force south of New York, while effectively ending active combat operations throughout most of the continent. British musicians reportedly play "The World Turned Upside Down" as 7,000 redcoats and Hessians march between American and French lines to lay down arms that will no longer serve imperial authority in North America. The symbolism proves appropriate for an event that transforms global power relationships. Cornwallis pleads illness to avoid the personal humiliation of surrendering his sword to Washington, leaving this duty to General Charles O'Hara, who initially attempts to yield to Rochambeau rather than acknowledge American authority. The French commander graciously redirects him toward Washington, who designates General Benjamin Lincoln to receive the surrender in recognition of Lincoln's own humiliation at Charleston the previous year. These ceremonial details matter because they establish precedents for how the world will treat America's claims to sovereign dignity. Yorktown aftermath demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of Allied cooperation, as French and American commanders debate how to exploit their victory most effectively to Grass's immediate departure for Caribbean operations that serve French rather than continental interests, illustrates how quickly alliance priorities can diverge when immediate dangers subside. Washington's proposals for coordinated assault on New York receive polite French consideration that clearly indicates minimal enthusiasm for operations that would primarily benefit American objectives. News of Cornwallis' surrender reaches London in late November, arriving at precisely the moment when Lord North's ministry faces mounting political pressure over the war's escalating costs and diminishing prospects for success. The Prime Minister reportedly receives the dispatch as he would have taken a ball in his breast immediately, recognizing that military defeat ensures political catastrophe for any government associated with failed American policy. "Oh God, it is all over" proves prophetic of both military and political consequences. Parliamentary debates through the winter of 1781 to 1782 reveal the empire's exhaustion. After 6 years of global warfare that has strained imperial resources beyond their sustainable limits, military expenses consume enormous sums, while French, Spanish, and Dutch naval operations threaten territories throughout the Caribbean, Mediterranean, and Indian Ocean that generate revenue essential for London's financial stability. Continuing American operations would require commitments that domestic politics cannot support indefinitely. Henry Knox's transportation of captured artillery from Yorktown to the Hudson Highlands demonstrates the logistical capabilities that continental forces have developed through years of improvisation and necessity. His winter march, with siege guns weighing thousands of pounds, proves no less remarkable than his earlier expedition from Ticonderoga, showing that American military administration can now accomplish tasks that European armies would attempt only with elaborate preparation and massive resources. Peace negotiations begin informally through intermediaries, who test whether the warring parties can identify terms that might end hostilities without requiring either side to abandon essential interests completely. British commissioners, led by Richard Oswald, gradually accept the reality that American independence has become irreversible, while seeking to preserve commercial relationships that might benefit both nations despite political separation. The discussions reveal how dramatically Yorktown has altered diplomatic possibilities throughout the Atlantic world. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay represent American interests in Paris, negotiations that will determine whether a military victory can be translated into diplomatic success that secures long-term national advantages. The task requires balancing gratitude to French allies against American interests that sometimes conflict with European objectives, particularly regarding territorial boundaries and commercial privileges that will shape the new nation's future development. Alliance obligations must not become permanent subordination. Preliminary peace articles signed November 30th, 1782, grant American commissioners most of their essential demands while preserving British dignity through face-saving compromises that allow both sides to claim reasonable success. The United States gains independence, territorial control to the Mississippi River, and fishing rights of Newfoundland that New England desperately needs. Britain retains Canada while recovering some Caribbean territories that compensate partially for North American losses. Definitive Treaty of Paris, concluded September 3, 1783, formally ends the global war that began as a colonial rebellion while establishing the United States as a sovereign nation recognized by all major European powers. The document represents remarkable diplomatic achievement for a country that existed only in declaration 7 years earlier, but has now earned international acceptance through military success and shrewd negotiation. American independence becomes international law rather than merely revolutionary aspiration. Washington's farewell to his officers at France's Tavern in New York epitomizes the Republican principles that have sustained patriot resistance through 8 years of warfare against overwhelming odds. His emotional goodbye to comrades who shared victory and defeat demonstrates that military success has not corrupted the democratic values that justified revolution in the first place. The commander who could have become king chooses instead to return power to civilian authority. December 23, 1783, witnesses the ceremony at Annapolis that completes Washington's transformation from rebellious general to Republican citizen, as he formally resigns his commission before Congress assembled in Maryland's temporary capital. The moment stuns European observers who cannot imagine military commanders voluntarily relinquishing power that conquest has placed within their grasp. King George III reportedly declares that if Washington keeps his promise to retire, he will be the greatest man in the world. Evacuation of New York on November 25, 1783, marks the final departure of metropolitan forces from territory that the United States now claims through right of revolution and treaty recognition. British ships carrying Loyalist refugees toward uncertain futures in Canada, Caribbean islands, or Britain itself, represent the human cost of political transformation that has created winners and losers whose fates will echo through generations. Revolution succeeds, but not without destroying lives of those who chose the losing side. Economic demobilization proves almost as challenging as military victory. As continental soldiers return to civilian pursuits in a nation whose financial structure has been shattered by years of warfare and inflation, many veterans receive land warrants instead of cash payments, creating Western settlements that will extend American population into territories that independence has secured. Others struggle with disabilities and poverty that peacetime society often ignores despite their wartime sacrifices. State governments face enormous debts accumulated during wartime, while lacking adequate revenue sources to meet obligations that creditors increasingly demand. Continental currency has become worthless through inflation that has destroyed confidence in paper money throughout the Confederation. Economic problems threaten political stability, as citizens who supported revolution discover that independence does not automatically guarantee prosperity or effective governance. Social changes accelerated by wartime experiences begin reshaping American society in ways that extend far beyond immediate political transformations. Women who manage businesses and farms during their husband's military service resist returning to purely domestic roles that peace might seem to require. African Americans who fought for liberty increasingly questioned why freedom remains limited to white citizens. When revolutionary principles proclaim universal human rights, religious revival spreads throughout the states as communities seek spiritual meaning for experiences that have tested faith while challenging traditional authority structures. The war has weakened established churches while strengthening evangelical denominations that emphasize personal relationships with divine authority rather than institutional hierarchy. Religious liberty guaranteed by state constitutions becomes practical reality that transforms American spiritual life. Westward migration accelerates as veterans and land speculators seek opportunities in territories that peace has opened for settlement. While Native American resistance has been temporarily reduced, Kentucky and Tennessee attract thousands of families seeking prosperity that established Eastern communities cannot provide. This expansion creates new challenges for national government that must balance competing claims while maintaining peace with Indian tribes, whose land settlers increasingly covet. International recognition of American independence transforms global diplomatic relationships. As European powers adjust to the reality of a new nation whose revolutionary principles challenge traditional assumptions about political authority and social organization, France discovers that American alliance serves immediate interests against Britain while threatening long-term stability of monarchical government. Everywhere, the revolution's example proves infectious in ways that its supporters did not anticipate. Constitutional questions that war postpone and now demand attention. As Americans discover that independence requires effective government, while revolutionary principles limit the authority that effective government traditionally exercises, the Articles of Confederation prove inadequate for national needs, while state governments often pursue local interests that conflict with continental necessities. Political theory must become practical governance, but theory and practice frequently disagree. Victory at Yorktown has achieved military independence, but political independence requires institutions that can preserve liberty while maintaining order, protect individual rights while promoting common welfare, and command respect while remaining accountable to popular will. The revolution has succeeded in destroying old authority, but must now create new government that serves principles for which Americans have fought, while avoiding the tyranny that justified rebellion in the first place. A world turned upside down must find new equilibrium that honors both liberty and responsibility, both individual freedom and collective security. That challenge awaits resolution through constitutional deliberation that will test whether revolutionary principles can create lasting government worthy of the sacrifices that independence has required. The military revolution has ended, but the political revolution has only just begun. Peace settles over the 13 states like morning mist after a violent storm, revealing a landscape forever changed by 8 years of revolutionary warfare. Get independence proclaimed in Philadelphia, and one at Yorktown proves to be only the beginning of a far greater challenge. Creating a government worthy of the principles for which so many Americans have died. The Articles of Confederation, hastily drafted during wartime when unity mattered more than efficiency, proved woefully inadequate for governing a nation that suddenly faces peacetime challenges requiring sustained cooperation. Congress lacks power to regulate commerce between squabbling states, collect adequate revenue, or enforce its decisions. The Confederation resembles a league of friendship more than a functional government, threatening to dissolve into 13 separate countries. Before the ink on the peace treaty is dried, financial crisis deepens as the new nation struggles with crushing wartime debts while lacking reliable sources of revenue. Continental currency has become worthless, dismissed with the phrase, "not worth a continental." States issue their own currencies, creating monetary chaos that paralyzes commerce. When Daniel Shays leads fellow veterans in armed rebellion against Massachusetts courts foreclosing on their farms, political leaders recognize that liberty without order becomes anarchy. Foreign powers test American resolve with barely concealed contempt. Britain refuses to evacuate frontier posts. Spain closes the Mississippi River to American commerce. And European diplomats questioned whether the United States will survive long enough to honor the agreements it makes. The Confederation appears to be fragmenting before it has truly begun. Mount Vernon provides the setting where Virginia and Maryland delegates, meeting to resolve river disputes, recognize that broader constitutional reform has become essential for national survival. Their discussions lead to the Annapolis Convention, which attracts only 5 states, but produces Alexander Hamilton's bold call for a constitutional convention to address the fundamental problems threatening the Union. Philadelphia's State House welcomes delegates once again in the summer of 1787, this time to create rather than declare. George Washington presides with the same dignity that sustained the Revolution, while James Madison arrives with detailed plans for a stronger federal government. The convention quickly discovers that effective reform requires scrapping the Articles entirely and creating something unprecedented, a republic spanning a continent. The debates are fierce. Large states demand representation based on population, while small states insist on equality. Southern delegates count their slaves for representation, while Northern representatives question whether property can vote. The Connecticut Compromise splits the difference with a bicameral legislature, while the 3-5 compromise reveals the moral contradictions that independence has failed to resolve. Ratification divides the nation between Federalists supporting the Constitution and anti-Federalists, fearing that strengthened federal authority threatens the liberty. Revolution was fought to secure the Federalist Papers, provide brilliant defenses of the new system, while anti-Federalist demands for explicit protection of individual rights forced the promise of a Bill of Rights that will limit governmental power through constitutional amendment. State-by-state ratification then proceeds through conventions that reveal Americans are still learning what self-government requires. When George Washington takes the presidential oath on April 30, 1789, he completes the transformation from revolutionary resistance to constitutional government while establishing precedents that prevent the presidency from becoming the monarchy that critics feared. The Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, fulfills Federalist promises while demonstrating that the Constitution remains a living document capable of peaceful improvement. As the French Revolution erupts across the Atlantic, Americans discover that their own revolution has been remarkably moderate, achieving change through constitutional methods rather than the chaos that seems to consume their former allies. The peaceful transfer of power from Federalists to Democratic Republicans following Thomas Jefferson's election in 1800 proves that constitutional government can survive partisan conflict. Americans have learned to distinguish between opposition to particular policies and treason against the nation, a lesson that many revolutions fail to master. By 1825, as the revolutionary generation passes from the scene, the United States has achieved most of the goals that independence was meant to secure: political freedom, economic prosperity, territorial expansion through the Louisiana Purchase, and international respect. The constitutional system has survived its initial tests while demonstrating remarkable capacity for peaceful change. Yet challenges remain that reveal how difficult it proves to translate revolutionary ideals into perfect practice. The westward expansion that fulfills revolutionary dreams displaces Native American tribes, whose rights the founders recognized in theory, but often ignored in practice. The slavery that contradicts revolutionary principles spreads westward, creating tensions that constitutional mechanisms may prove unable to resolve peacefully. Revolutionary principles continue working their way through American society, challenging established privileges while extending liberty's benefits to groups initially excluded from full citizenship. The process proves gradual and sometimes painful, but the direction remains clear toward greater inclusion and more complete realization of human equality. As night falls over the republic that revolution created, Americans can reflect upon achievements that have exceeded their boldest hopes, while recognizing that liberty requires constant vigilance. The revolution has ended, but its work continues through constitutional government that provides peaceful mechanisms for extending freedom's benefits while preserving the union that independence made possible. The last veterans sleep peacefully in graves scattered across the continent. Their courage is made free. Their legacy lives on not merely in the independence they won, but in the constitutional system they helped create, a government that derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, while protecting the unalienable rights that make human dignity possible. The American Revolution finds its true conclusion not in military victory, but in the quiet miracle of constitutional government that serves revolutionary principles while adapting to challenges the founders could never have imagined. The story ends where it began, with ordinary people making extraordinary choices about human freedom, proving that the revolutionary idea that all men are created equal can become more than just words on parchment. In this peaceful moment, the revolution's greatest victory becomes clear, not merely independence from tyranny, but the creation of institutions that make human liberty possible for generations yet unborn. The fire of freedom, lit in Philadelphia and preserved through 8 years of warfare, now burns steadily in the hearth of constitutional government, tended by citizens who understand that eternal vigilance remains liberty's price. The American Revolution is complete.